Well, greetings and welcome back to this study of Paul's letter to Philippi. And we are going to be looking at the concluding verses of chapter 2 today. That would be verses 17 through 30 in particular. And in those verses, we're really going to see vivid illustrations of what he has talked about previously in this chapter, and even in the entirety of the letter that has gone before. But specifically some of the things that he highlighted and emphasized at the beginning of this chapter are brought out in personal examples. Paul himself, the Philippian believers, Timothy, Epaphroditus. We're going to see this self-sacrificing, one-anothering love manifested here, really, before our eyes. And also in these verses, we're going to see a contrast. And I think I could say this without being in danger of speaking in a way of exaggeration, but in contrast, the majority report is all men look upon their own things, not the things which be of Christ. So these he highlights as being examples and illustrations of the transforming work of Christ dwelling in them, stand in sharp contrast to the larger part who are not committed to this degree and are still very much consumed and careful about their own affairs. And whatever that entails, he doesn't give us all the specifics, but he just says their own things. And I think it would be helpful before we look at these last verses of narrative, and that's really what they are, more of what is happening, what is going on, his hopes to come and visit the Philippians and so forth, Epaphroditus' trip to see them, and being able to bring Paul word about their circumstances and how they're doing, which is Paul's concern for all of these churches, is that they are prospering in the Lord and that they're being furthered in the faith and growing in love and service to one another and service to Christ as they serve one another. So I'm going to begin reading at verse 1 because, as I said, I think it will be helpful for us to see what he has taught before and how these examples that we find in verses 17 through 30 really project and show us and declare in a living way the transforming work of Christ in these lives. So, verse 1, if there be therefore any consolation in Christ, if any comfort of love, if any fellowship of the Spirit, if any bowels and mercies, fulfill you my joy, and be ye like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord, of one mind. Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves. Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. Let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. And being found in fashion as a man, he humbled himself, and became obedient unto death, even the death of the cross. Wherefore God also hath highly exalted him, and given him a name which is above every name. And at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, things in heaven, things in earth, things under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Wherefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God which worketh in you both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Do all things without murmurings and disputings, that you may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God without rebuke, in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding forth the word of life, that I may rejoice in the day of Christ, that I have not run in vain, neither labored in vain. Yes, and if I be offered upon the sacrifice and service of your faith, I joy, and rejoice with you all. For the same cause also you do joy and rejoice with me. And first of all, in these first two verses where we're picking up today in our commentary, we see a mutual love, a mutual joy in sacrificing for one another. Paul for them, they for him, in these verses 17 and 18. So again, a perfect illustration of what he has just covered in regards to Christ as being the ultimate example of self-sacrificial love and ministering to others. And here Paul says, I rejoice to be offered, to be literally to be poured out as a drink offering, hearkening back to the Old Testament drink offerings and the sacrificial system and the worship of God under the Old Covenant. This is what this is a reference to, poured out as a libation, as a drink offering. I rejoice to be poured out for you all. Makes me think of what he says to the Corinthians about willing to be spent for them. So there is a vital connection here between he and the Philippian believers. That is what he talks about when he says we are members one of another. And literally this is what he's expressing here in these words. I would rejoice, or I do rejoice, to be poured out on your service of faith, your sacrifice of faith, and you likewise toward me in whatever way they can minister and be a profit to him. And so this is mutual. There's a reciprocal here. That's the love that's going on and sacrifice. And then he says in verse 19, but I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timotheus shortly unto you, that I also may be of good comfort when I know your state. So what I spoke to earlier, he's concerned to know their circumstances, that word state, their circumstances, what is going on among them. No doubt a report on their growth, a report on how they are doing spiritually, how they are doing as far as the unity that he was speaking about here earlier. Are they of one mind? Knowing that coming here later on in this chapter, he will have to give a matter of admonition to a couple of ladies there that evidently were not of one mind, exhorting them to be of one mind. So this is something that is of a concern to Paul, and just how they're doing spiritually and their circumstances and what is going on there among them. He is anxious to hear this. And so this is the reason Timothy is going to come to minister to them, of course, but also to be able to bring back word to Paul. And then he goes on in verse 20, and this is that contrast that I spoke about. For I have no man like-minded, so evidently no one presently there from that area where he is imprisoned and so forth. But he speaks of having no man like-minded, or literally of similar spirit, who will naturally care for your state. Notice, who will naturally care for your state. And that's interesting insight. The new nature, who will naturally care for your state. Where is this new nature? This new nature is this sacrificial love for others. And Paul says, I have no man like that right now. And that is very concerning. And he speaks of Verse 21, all seeking their own. What a contrast this is to verse 4 of this chapter, where he says, look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others. Well, you have some here that are clearly professing to be followers of Christ and believers, but Paul is saying they're characterized by seeking their own, pursuing their own, not the things which are Jesus Christ. And of course, the most important thing that is Jesus Christ are his people, are his redeemed ones. And so there is not a natural care in these. There is not a seeking to minister, to labor, to sacrifice for these bought ones of Christ. And so as I read that, I'm reminded again of the age-old problem from the first century on down to 2025, that the majority report, tragically, sadly, is this half-heartedness, this not really engaged, this not really committed, scattered in our affections and in our minds and in our hearts and in our care. And so this being of a similar spirit with Paul, with Timothy, as we will see here in a moment with Epaphroditus, is the minority report. And the majority report is being careful about many other things. And so that is it's a hindrance. It's something that is used powerfully and successfully by Satan. Certainly our flesh is geared that way to seek our own things since the fall. The world around us is continually preaching that to us and speaking that into our ears and projecting that into our eyes, that we're here for ourselves. We're here to enjoy ourselves, to care for ourselves, to entertain ourselves, what have you, on and on and on, etc., etc. And we succumb to that. We don't have to, but we do succumb to it. We know better. We know that there is this infinite contrast between the temporal and the eternal, but we continually, it seems, choose the temporal over the eternal, exert ourselves, weary ourselves, worry ourselves, spend our time, limited that we have, our time, talents, energy, resources on those things that are not eternal, those things that are temporal, and many times ultimately have no ongoing value or purpose. We're fallen in the flesh. Our flesh is no good. Like Paul says, nothing good dwells in me, that is in my flesh. And certainly we could all confess that as believers if we know ourselves, just our own self-consciousness and awareness that the Spirit gives us of ourselves, and of viewing the world around us. The pursuit is for today, and what pleases me, what pleases my flesh. And sadly, what falls by the wayside are the things that be of Jesus Christ, the things that are His. And His people, His church, gets left by the wayside and gets the leftovers of the time, the talents, the energy, the resources, and so on. So this was going on here as well. But the conviction of this is, don't be this way. The convicting truth, don't be this way. You don't have to be this way. This is not something that is unavoidable. You just can't help it. No, you have been delivered from the power of sin. The only way this can happen, these who are seeking their own rather than the things of Jesus Christ, is for them to be yielding to it. Romans 6, don't yield your members to these things, but yield your members as servants of righteousness. So there's a sad note in these closing lines of chapter 2, and it's right here. In the midst of the encouraging things about Paul, Philippians, Timothy, and Epaphroditus, who we'll be reading about in a moment, there is the reality. There is the reality that most don't have this kind of commitment. And we should read this and say, Lord, I don't want to be like those on the negative side. I want to be like those that positive things are spoken about. So as we continue on, verse 22, but you know the proof of him, speaking of Timothy, that as a son with his father, he has served with me in the gospel. So Paul, again, speaking of himself as a spiritual father to Timothy. He is a son, and we know that Timothy was very dear to the Apostle Paul. We see his words to him in 1 and 2 Timothy, and 2 Timothy believed to be the last letter of Paul before his martyrdom, and encouraging Timothy to fight the good fight of faith, to not be ashamed of his chain, to not be fearful, that he was mindful of Timothy's tears, to preach the word in season, out of season, to not grow discouraged, to not compromise. So just a great word of encouragement from a spiritual father and mentor that Paul was to Timothy. And so Paul is commending Timothy here as he will be among the Philippians of the godliness of this man, of the faithfulness. He has labored. He is a laborer, a fellow laborer with me in the gospel of Jesus Christ. Him, therefore, I hope to send presently, so soon as I shall see how it will go with me. So again, Paul is in prison. He wants to get someone to go to them in the interval, not knowing when or if he will be released, seeing how it will go with me. But he intends to send Timothy to the Philippian church in order to check on them, as I said earlier, to see how things are going, how they are doing in their walk with Christ. And this is very important for him to know. He wants to know. He's not just there sitting in prison in a careless manner. These people are on his heart. We started out about him, how he speaks in the beginning of this letter, praying for them. I thank my God upon every remembrance of you. Recall that back at the beginning, the opening of this letter. So these people are on his heart. They are not afar off and Christians way over there somewhere and kind of in the recesses of the back of his mind. No, they're on the forefront of his mind. And the care of all the churches, as he speaks about earlier, was a very real matter to the Apostle Paul. And so he is interceding for them. He's praying for them. He's concerned for them. His heart is there with them. He's there with them in spirit, though not in flesh. And so he hopes to send Timothy to no doubt be a comfort to them and to see and to discern how they are doing in the Lord. Then he goes on to verse 24 and says, but I trust in the Lord that I also myself shall come shortly. So a hope there again that he will be released and be able to personally come. Once more, he has a desire, even though these journeys once again are arduous. We need to remind ourselves of how they had to travel back then. This was no light matter. You're not going to get on a jet plane or even in an automobile or some kind of a diesel or fuel powered ship. It's an arduous journey. It's a journey that is full of perils and just physical weariness. But Paul wants to see them and is willing to go through that particular exertion in order to see them, just as Timothy will have to go it, just as we see Epaphroditus here in the next verses. Yet I supposed it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus. So Epaphroditus has already been sent. Epaphroditus is one that is from among them, so he had come to Paul, and now he has been sent back to them. Yet I suppose it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and companion in labor. So he, like Timothy, is a companion in laboring in the gospel, and fellow soldier, but your messenger, and he that ministered to my wants. So your messenger, he came from Philippi to Paul, which again gives us insight into the willingness of Epaphroditus to be associated with Paul in prison, which was to put himself in danger by that identification, to minister to one who was a prisoner would bring you into suspicion and certainly would associate you with whatever this person was in prison for. And so you're confessing outwardly that I am for him, I am identifying with him, I am even believing what he believes and preaches and what has gotten him here in this position in the first place. And so Epaphroditus had to understand the very possible ramifications of this when he came, just as Timothy. But nevertheless, he comes, he makes the arduous journey to go there, and now he has been sent back to make that long journey again, back to the Philippians. For he longed after you all, verse 26, that is Epaphroditus, longed after you all. Why? And was full of heaviness. Why? Because that you had heard that he had been sick. So here is an insight into the character of Epaphroditus. He is concerned about them being concerned and burdened about him being sick. He longed after you. He had it says he was full of heaviness. This wasn't some light, oh, that's a shame. I hate that they're worried about me being sick. I wish they wouldn't do that. This was a heaviness. This was a burden that they were burdened. He did not desire them to be burdened and sorrowful and concerned and full of care for him in this regards. So the negative sense of that. Certainly that showed their love for Epaphroditus, but Epaphroditus would have rather them be filled with joy rather than care and burden and heaviness for him. So now he's full of heaviness because of them being concerned in this way. Paul goes on describing the seriousness of this sickness. He says, for indeed he was sick, nigh unto death. So this was no head cold. This was no flu. This was something that was very, very serious and could have been terminal. But Paul goes on to say, but God had mercy on him. God had mercy on Epaphroditus. He healed him because now Epaphroditus has become well enough to travel back to Philippi. But the exertion of the trip to Rome, the exertion of the trip to see Paul, which is assumed here he's in a Roman imprisonment at this point, is, or could be part of what broke his health, or at least contributed to it in some way. But we do know that Paul will go on to say that he was in this case because of his labor in the Gospels. His labor in the gospel, gospel, not Gospels. His labor in the gospel, his service unto the people of God, is what in some degree wore him down and brought about this sickness. God had mercy on him, and he goes on to say, and not on him only, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. So not only was the healing of Epaphroditus merciful with regards to Epaphroditus, but Paul says it was a mercy on me. This dear brother, if he would have passed away, that would have caused much grief for the Apostle Paul. And this dear brother who had ministered to him, this dear messenger from the church at Philippi. And so the Lord spared Paul the grief, the sorrow of losing this dear fellow laborer in Christ. And he raised him up and he has sent him back. Verse 28, I sent him therefore the more carefully. He sent him with care. Once again, knowing what he had gone through, knowing how close he had been to death. And now he sends him carefully. He takes care, no doubt, in view here that not wanting to chance any kind of relapse or doing anything that would cause a problem with Epaphroditus being able to reach them safely, that is Philippi. That when you see him again, you may rejoice. So he sends him carefully. He sends him with love. He sends him with a rejoicing that God has healed him. And he sends them with the intent that when they see him, when he comes to his own people there, his own church, they will rejoice, that I may be the less sorrowful. So notice what he's saying here. He's sorrowful that Epaphroditus is not presently with him. But he will be able to rejoice that he is back with the saints at Philippi. So there was that care, there was that concern as Epaphroditus was going through his sickness. Now he is recovered and is able to make that trip back. Paul, is not rejoicing for him to be separated from him, but he is rejoicing that he is able to go back to Philippi, and that, as it were, lessens his own sorrow at the separation from that fellowship and that ministry that was going on from Epaphroditus. So you see once more this reciprocal love, this mutual concern that your rejoicing is my rejoicing. If you can rejoice with him, receive him, he says, verse 29, therefore in the Lord with all gladness, and hold such in reputation. Hold such and the word here, reputation, means precious, value, esteemed. So hold him as precious. This is a precious brother in the Lord, and his ministry, his willingness to go through these arduous travels and to minister and to be nigh unto death. He goes on in verse 30 to say, because for the work of Christ. Now let me read that again. Because for the work of Christ he was nigh unto death. So that tells you right there that this was not some sickness brought on by some wrongdoing in Epaphroditus or some negligence in Epaphroditus, but this sickness, this illness that brought him nigh unto the gates of death was for the work of Christ. So, doesn't tell us again specifically. We can speculate whether it was just exhaustion, exertion, what have you, lack of proper food. We don't know what all he experienced. But it was for the work of Christ, Paul says. It was vitally, it was directly connected to the work of Christ, this sickness was. So, here's an application for that. Working and laboring and striving for Christ does not mean you will be healthy, wealthy, and prosperous. Matter of fact, we study throughout church history, whether it be missionaries or the apostles or Epaphroditus or Timothy with his stomach difficulties and sicknesses and so forth. When we study through that, what do we see is some of the most eminent saints, some of those who are the most earnest and fervent in their service for the Lord, are often stricken with grave illnesses, often die young, often lose family members, often, go through various trials and tribulations, even though they are valiantly serving the Lord. So these things are not removed from the children of God and those serving God. Matter of fact, it seems sometimes to be worse, whether that's part of the spiritual battle, the attack that is coming against God's servants, but it is certainly there, and we even see it here. And even though Epaphroditus was earnestly serving Christ, he was not spared the effects of a deathly illness during this time. Timothy was not spared those stomach issues that Paul addresses there in his letter to Timothy. So we can't ever believe that there is an exemption for the people of God. We are subject to the same illnesses that everyone else is, the same exhaustion that everyone else is, and yea, even more if you understand that this is a battle. that this is an attack, that there are spiritual forces at work. And so it is tough, it is rough, it is hard to follow Christ and to serve Christ. He does not promise ease. He does not promise an easy, smooth road. But it is indeed warfare and struggle, and the Christian is going to be scarred, and the Christian is going to have various troubles and trials and adversaries come against them. Like Paul says in another place, a great door and effectual is open unto us, and there are many adversaries. That's a given. We can count on that. And so that's one of the things that I see here in this, that for the work of Christ he was nigh unto death. But you notice his attitude in the last part of this verse, not regarding his life, willing to sacrifice himself. Why? To supply your lack of service toward me. So, your lack of service, in a sense, they were not, and this again is not a slam, this is not a put down, but it's just a statement of reality. They were not able to be there and minister to him in this physical, on-the-spot way, in the vicinity, in the place way. Epaphroditus, coming out from them, was willing to take on that ministry and literally go to where Paul was. And he was willing to sacrifice his own life, which evidently he came right to the brink of here on this trip and in this work. And Paul says he not regarding his own life. So it's clear that he understood the cost. It's clear that he understood the potential for harm to himself, for illness, for even death. And yet he was willing to do it anyway. So how this reflects Christ and the love of Christ and the self-sacrificing spirit, which is the Spirit of Christ, in all these we've seen in these closing verses of this chapter. But to remind us again, this is not the majority report. This is those rare ones, you might say, those gems, those who are counted, as he says, to count Epaphroditus as precious, and certainly to esteem them for the work's sake. And this is what, and this kind of character is what we should be prodding one another onto in our one anothering, in our fellowship, in our speaking the word into one another, in our pressing into Christ. So we don't want to be as those who seek their own and not the things which be Jesus Christ. We want to seek his things, and his things again primarily are his people, his church, and to be fully on board, fully engaged. I'm talking to me, I'm talking to you. This is what we are called to as believers. And I get disgusted at myself. I get disgusted at what I see around me in this American culture. I know I've beat this maybe too much, but I can't get it out of my mind because it's so vivid every day. Is that this is a life of amusement and entertainment and seeking our own things. And we have become so weak and powerless and something other than what we should be, and neglecting the things of the Lord. And that is not going to be looked on lightly by him. And we can't expect that. And we shouldn't expect that, or he would not be who he is. So I pray this is helpful to us. I pray it's an encouragement to be an Epaphroditus, seek to be an Epaphroditus, seek to be a Timothy, Paul and the Philippian church and their mutual cares we started out with in these verses. But seek to be not the status quo, but seek to press to that higher place. Seek to be a Joshua in his statement, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. You know, if you want to serve these other gods, if you want to run after all this other stuff, that's your choice, that's your responsibility, that's your accountability. But let us be those who fervently seek the Lord, who fervently sought us. Thank you.